There's an interesting story happening in Madison, Wisconsin, and this involves property taxes, and it's like a statistician or it's like a CPA's dream or something. But bear with me because I think this gets to the heart of a religious problem. I'm going to show you a website right here. It's for Pres House, Pres, in the top corner there, and basically, Pres House is basically a student dorm for people who are part of the Presbyterian group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I don't have any problem with the group or anything, but Pres House is basically a fraternity of sorts, but it's for members of the Presbyterian Student Center Foundation at UW-Madison. There's also one other apartment complex. This is called Lumen House right here. And this is for members of the Catholic organization at UW-Madison. Like if you're a member of that group, you're eligible to stay in an apartment that is this apartment and whatever. Frats do this all the time. Other clubs might have student housing for members of their group. Nothing weird about that. Here's where things get weird. In 2009, the state of Wisconsin passed a law about these kinds of, I'm going to call them dorms. They're student apartment complexes, but let's call them dorms. And in 2009, the state lawmakers, mostly Republicans, they basically passed a law saying, let's make housing like that tax exempt. And this is what they passed specifically. Let me show you this law. It says when it comes to property taxes, we will say you don't have to pay property taxes if three things are true. One, the facility is owned by a nonprofit group. Two, at least 90% of the facility's residents are enrolled at UW-Madison, and you are housing no more than 300 such students. And three, you offer services and outreach programs to the residents or the public. So they said, if you fall into this category, you're providing student housing just for UW-Madison, and you don't have more than 300 people, and 90% of the people who live there are students enrolled at UW-Madison, no property taxes for you. Here's why that's weird. The way that was worded, it only applied to one dorm, to one student housing facility, and it was that Presbyterian house. That's it. So it doesn't mention religion in the law, but it only benefits religion in the law. It was actually worded more broadly that it would have helped a lot of other groups, but one lawmaker narrowed that wording, and he said we needed to do that because, quote, common sense would say it should be tax exempt as a religious-based residence, but the tax code was unclear. So they changed the law specifically to give a religious dorm a tax exemption. So that's part one of this story. Before that statute went into effect, Presbyterian House paid about $160,000 in taxes. After that law went into effect, they paid $0 in taxes. And here's part two. Here's the second problem with this. When you say that one giant apartment complex, student housing, when you say they don't have to pay property taxes, that means other people in the community have to pay higher property taxes to make up for the lost revenue. In fact, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel at the time, this is in 2011, they actually wrote an article about this. Let me show this to you. Calculations based on the best estimate city assessors have, which come from vague and poorly reported data, show the exemptions are costly, driving up tax bills for average homeowners by nearly 20%. That's close to $800 more for a Milwaukee property taxpayer with a home assessed at $175,000. So because they're giving all these tax breaks to these student dorms that are belonging to the Presbyterian Church group, and other groups as well get property taxes. I think the same article here noted like 40% of the buildings were tax exempt, but that means the burden is on everybody else to make up for all that lost revenue. That's the problem with all this, right? So guess what happened in 2011? This problem People complained about property taxes so much, not just to Democrats, but to Republicans as well, that in 2011, the Republican legislature in Wisconsin said, we got to get rid of some of these tax exemptions. And they passed a law to get rid of it. And then Scott Walker was the governor, and he was like, but I want to run for president as a Republican. So he vetoed that bill. So the tax exemption for Prez House remained in place. So then guess what happened in 2013, a couple years later? Now we have even more Republicans in the legislature, and they changed the property tax law again. And this is what it says now. Get this. The same, like, we're going to allow student housing to be tax exempt. You could see 3M. This is under the category of student housing facilities. And they say you can be tax exempt if you're run by a nonprofit, 90% go to UW-Madison, you don't have more than 300 people, you do some outreach or whatever. But look at number 4 that just got added in 2013. The facility has to be in existence and meeting the requirements of all the stuff that's highlighted on July 2nd, 2013, which is like when this law was passed, except if the facility is located in a municipally designated landmark and it's in existence and meets the requirements on September 30th, 2014. That is such a weirdly specific thing to change the law about. But here's what they basically said in English. They said, okay, tax exemptions only apply to everyone who is already getting it, and any building that's a designated landmark that happens to be built a year from now. And guess what? There was only one other building that was a locally designated landmark that happened to be a student housing facility, and it was Lumen House, the one run by the Catholic Church. So they changed the law in 2013 to say, okay, the Prez House can still have a tax exemption because that's the only one that was affected by it. But it turns out there's a Catholic facility that's being built right now, and it's going to open in a couple months. Why don't we change the law to say, okay, they get a tax exemption too, but after them, nobody else at all? Like, this went from being a benefit for one religious group to they changed the law literally to benefit one other religious group. And then they closed the door after that. Do you understand what the problem is here? Like, unbelievable. And the diocese, it was so clear about how the law was changed to benefit them. This is the press release from like the Diocese of Madison. They were thanking Republican lawmakers for changing that law. Their efforts with their colleagues resulted in language that now clearly stipulates that Lumen House, a project of faith-based student housing and outreach ministry sponsored by the Cathedral Parish, will be tax exempt as was envisioned from the beginning. So they took over this historic landmark building in Madison specifically so it could be housing for members of the Catholic Church. And they're like, hey, lawmakers, we need a tax break for this building, but the law says we don't have one. Then the lawmaker said, okay, we'll change the law just to help you out. And then we'll make sure no one else ever gets helped by it ever again. Okay. So the reason I bring all this up is because the Freedom from Religion Foundation is now filing a lawsuit over all of this. Not FFRF specifically, but their co-presidents, Annie Laurie Gaylor and Dan Barker, who are in that picture. They're filing a lawsuit against these laws. And what they say is that change in 2013, that basically created an arbitrary date of existence requirement that grandfathers in any properties that were already getting the tax exemption and excludes all the other ones. And what FFRF is saying is, well, listen, we're based in Madison. What if years from now we want to buy a building and make it student housing for, say, members of the Secular Student Alliance at UW-Madison? What if we want to do that? Which, by the way, is not even weird about, like, FFRF has a lot of money. Theoretically, that is something that they could do and only they could do. But what if they wanted to create a dorm for members of the local atheist group at UW-Madison, because according to the law, even though they're doing the same thing as the Presbyterian group and the Catholic group, the atheists would not get a tax exemption. They're also suing because they're saying, we don't get this tax break, but our property taxes have gone up because you're giving all these tax breaks to religious groups as well. And they're mad about that. And finally, they say, when these laws were changed, there were no public hearings, no committee reports, no serious debate over whether this change was good or legal. And finally, they say, this isn't even really student housing. It's not cheaper. Those two buildings charge fair market rates for anyone renting their apartments. They're not free to students. They're not cheaper for students. So, like, what part of this is charity? These are just commercial properties. These are real estate companies, these churches, that get away with not paying taxes because they happen to fall under some religious umbrella. And this is what their lawsuit says here. Look at number 44 in their lawsuit here. Based on their combined estimated $33 million in value, omitting the Pres House and Lumen House Apartments from the property tax rolls is approximately the equivalent of exempting an entire neighborhood from paying property taxes, which is a big freaking deal. And this is the other thing they point out. There are three plaintiffs, Dan Barker, I mentioned, Annie Laurie Gaylor, and also, I want to make sure I get the name right. Another plaintiff's name is David Peterson, but they also pointed out right here, look at number 61. For over a decade, Miss Gaylor and Mr. Barker and Mr. Peterson have been paying higher property taxes along with all other Madison property taxpayers, in part to make up for the unconstitutional omission of these properties from the city tax rolls. Further, the exemption was created and later amended to unlawfully favor two religious organizations to the exclusion of all other religious or non-religious organizations, including us. FFRF is unable to ever qualify for the exemption if it were to invest in rental properties aimed at renting to UW-Madison students. So that is a fair point. I would be mad about that as well. Another thing they pointed out is, I said their lawsuit said you're losing the equivalent of like an entire neighborhood of property taxes. They actually calculated it. It came out to about $400,000 a year that the city of Madison is not getting because those two houses are not being charged property taxes. Now, in response to all this, Pres House, the Presbyterian one, they said, you guys, we don't have to pay property taxes, but we understand that we are mooching off the city. We use their water, we use their fire department if we ever needed it, etc. So we voluntarily give $15,000 a year to the city. It's something called payment in lieu of taxes, pilot. And they say we give $15,000 in pilot fees. A lot of nonprofits do something like that. But if you're paying $15,000, but getting away with not paying your share of $400,000, that's not a gift to the city. You're still robbing the city just a little less. So I don't know why that's a defense of what they are doing here. I don't know if the lawsuit will be successful. I know that everyone involved in making these tax exemptions a reality made it very clear they were changing the rules to benefit these two religious apartment complexes. But the statutes themselves don't mention religion, so I don't know. I don't know that they need to, because the winks come through loud and clear. So we'll see. Look, the legislature could easily have said all properties designed for college students that provide certain services could be tax exempt, but they didn't do that. They targeted those laws to specifically benefit those religious groups. FFRF is just trying to correct these mistakes, because they actually said, we tried to go through all the proper channels to get this fixed, and all the people responded to us saying, sorry, you're asking the wrong people. I have no control. I have to follow the law. You should ask these people. Then FFRF would write a letter to another agency, and that agency would say, well, why are you asking us? We have nothing to do with it. Go ask the first group. And it's just a big circle jerk or something. FFRF also said, we are suing the city of Madison and those two apartment complexes. We are not suing the state government. We're suing Madison because the city is actually the one providing the exemption. So I think I'll leave it there. Interesting case. I'll be curious to see how that one plays out. Gotta love those tailored laws that benefit a very specific religious institution. Absolutely. And it's always interesting because the people writing those laws try to pretend this is totally not what they're doing, even though we all know exactly what they're doing. The law is explicit to benefit a religious organization. I'd say the lawsuit should be pretty cut and dried. I would like to think that, but the courts are not exactly friendly to atheist litigants. Even harder for renters. Property tax goes up, rent goes up as well. I think you're right about that. I don't know the numbers for the rentals, but yeah, the property taxes in Madison went up because they're not getting that money from all the people who are there. There was a city in Texas. There was an article about this in the New York Times. It might have been 15, 20 years ago, but there was a city in Texas that there would be people coming to this town saying they want to build a church. And the city officials were like, well, of course you can build a church in our community. Take this land. You can buy it for whatever it costs. You can have a church. The problem is because it's a church, they are not paying property taxes. And the city had so many churches, they had no money to actually run the city and they didn't know what to do. And that's why all the churches were coming there because they knew they could build their church. But the city had no income coming in because there was no room for business because every block just had a gazillion churches. Like, you got to set a limit somewhere.